Welcome and good afternoon. My name is Michelle Spencer. I am the Associate Director of the Bloomberg American Health Initiative and faculty within the Health Policy and Management Department here at Hopkins School of Public Health. We're here today to talk about an important new law known as extreme risk laws. These laws are now in 15 states and the District of Columbia. Today at the Bloomberg School of Public Health, we are featuring 4 jurisdictions from across the country where these extreme risk laws are being implemented through great efforts of law enforcement and other partner organizations who are committed to gun violence prevention. We are also announcing the launch of a website that was developed specifically to support implementation of these efforts. Let me turn to one of our guests, Josh Horowitz, who is the Executive Director of the Educational Fund to Stop Gun Violence. Josh, can you share a bit about why we're here today, focusing on extreme risk laws and their implementation?
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you very much for having me, and thanks to the Bloomberg School for sponsoring this. Extreme risk laws give law enforcement clear legal authority to remove firearms when someone is in crisis. This law was developed with some support from academics here at the Bloomberg School and is now, as Michelle mentioned, in 15 states and the District of Columbia. To make sure that these laws are as effective as possible, law enforcement needs the tools and the experience to implement them, to make sure that they're done well, to make sure that the life-saving potential of these laws are met. To do that, we are here today among different jurisdictions to share best practices, to share what we know, to learn from each other. And at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we identify best practices for some of the jurisdictions that are just getting going now. We know from the research that for every 10 to 20 orders that are served, 1 life is saved. That means to save lives, we need orders filed. And to do that, we need to make sure that we're working with law enforcement so that they have all the information, the skills and the information to get this done, which is one of the reasons we're so happy to announce, as Michelle mentioned, our new website, which will have a lot of those tools. So we're here to learn and share with each other.
So thank you, Josh. I want to take a moment to have our panelists introduce themselves. I do want to note, however, the richness of this panel that includes lawyers, prosecutors, elected officials, and as you've heard, one of our lead researchers here, Josh Horowitz. And I want to be able to tell you that we are really thrilled that you're able to join us for this convening to talk about this important new law and what states can do as they think about implementation or where they are in their implementation processes. So I'll turn to you, Nicole, to please introduce yourself. Tell us a little about you, the work that you do in the state that you're representing.
I'm here from City of San Diego, the San Diego City Attorney's Office. My name is Nicole Crosby. I'm the Chief of Strategic Development, and I manage our gun violence restraining order program. I helped develop the procedures to conduct the outreach. We do statewide training, and I'm part of that training team to make sure that the vast space of California is informed and the law enforcement and attorneys who represent them know how to implement the law.
Thanks. Jeff Brooker, I'm a supervising deputy city attorney with the San Diego City Attorney's Office. I work with Nicole. I'm sort of the boots on the ground. I file all the cases, I review all the cases, I conduct all the hearings in court. I'm in constant communication with law enforcement officers up and down the state on their fledgling attempts to file these questions on procedure, questions on method, and how this law applies to the state of California through what we're doing in San Diego.
Hello, I'm Kim Wyatt. I'm a senior deputy prosecuting attorney from the King County Prosecutor's Office and part of the Regional Domestic Violence Firearms Enforcement Unit, which is a collaborative group between the Seattle City Attorney's Office, the King County Prosecutor's Office, Seattle Police Department, and King County Sheriff's Department. And my job is to work as a firearms prosecutor, and I primarily work on extreme risk protection order cases.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Shannon Lockheart. I'm the General Counsel of the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office. I was a member of the team that implemented the risk protection order process when Florida's law was enacted.
Hi, I'm Darren Popkin. I'm the sheriff in Montgomery County, Maryland. I also sit as the legislative co-chair for all of Maryland's law enforcement, the Chiefs and Sheriffs Association in Maryland. And during the 2018 legislative session in Annapolis, one of the laws that was drafted was the Extreme Risk Protective Order law here in Maryland. And I had the opportunity to actually be a part of the legislative work group that put the statute together. And I have been fortunate for the last little over a year to not only have worked on the legislation, but the implementation and the training of law enforcement throughout the state of Maryland. As we've now seen that the law hasn't been in effect since October 1 of 18. It's been about 8 months in Maryland. And it is truly a life-saving endeavor so far. And although it is inherently dangerous to law enforcement and others, we are working very hard to make sure that these are followed and that the law is adhered to in the state of Maryland.
Thank you all. So for our audience that are joining us via live stream, I have a few questions that I'm going to be asking of our panelists this afternoon. And then we're going to take questions from you. So I will encourage you to please send your questions to implementerpo@jhu.edu. Again, that is implementerpo@jhu.edu. And we'll get to those questions at the second half of this hour. So let me start with our friends from the West Coast, both Nicole and Jeff. California was the first state to pass an extreme risk law that authorized family members to petition the court for what California calls the gun violence restraining order. How did the city attorney's office respond to this new law? And why did you see it as an important work for the office of the city attorney's office to handle?
So this was a really big issue for the city attorney when she was elected. And the relationship that we have, the city attorney's office, with the San Diego Police Department was really the most critical in implementation and working together to make the communities safer, make the officers who are responding to individuals time and time again safer. So the real mechanism that we thought was important was I missed the second part of your question.
Why was it important for the city attorney's office to take on this work?
Oh, we have a population of 1.5 million people. We have a very low homicide rate, and we want to make people healthier. And in California specifically, there are a lot of crimes that involve mental health and drug abuse and substance abuse of various sorts that have been sort of decriminalized, which provides less of a tool for law enforcement to use. There are a lot of gaps in the mental health capacity. So this is the ability for law enforcement officers to be proactive in safety as opposed to reactive, which is commonly what occurs.
Jeff?
Yeah, as a corollary to that, I think the primary mission is just public safety. I think there's a nationwide sense of frustration that's out there every time we see one of these shootings in the news, and that frustration only heightens when we read about it after the fact, breaking it down, how there were red flags. People did know about this. People were, afraid of the shooter before the tragedy had occurred. And I think that frustration kind of culminated into our city attorney, Mara Elliott, putting this program together with not only the political will, but the means to cement those relationships so that we could actually put something in place that is seizing guns from people who should not have them, who are dangerous, and exhibit this red flag behavior.
What partner organizations were you working with, or do you partner with?
The primary was the San Diego Police Department, being that law enforcement is the petitioner. Without that partnership, I think we would have never succeeded to the extent with the excess that we have had, but also the courts. It takes all three to conduct a hearing. All three of those entities have to have the will and have to have the know-how. And when you're implementing a new law, it's never easy, especially when it's quasi-civil criminal. The courts have never seen them. Law enforcement is not used to filing things on behalf of themselves as an agency directly in court. And most functions of city attorneys, don't typically take on what feels like a prosecutorial role in this sense.
Thank you for that. So I want to turn to Kim and thank you. You're also working with the prosecutor's office in King County, Washington. How is your office organized to implement the Washington law? And I'll note here that in Washington, the law is called Extreme Risk Protection Order.
Correct. And you'll also hear us refer to it as ERPO. But you're right. Our law passed in December of 2016, so fairly new law. And like most laws, there was no money for implementation. So we struggled. And I can tell you in 2017, there's maybe a handful of extreme risk protection order petitions throughout the state. And really in 2018, when our unit formed, and our unit was developed to enforce folks who are subject to protection orders with an order to surrender weapons, which also includes in our unit the extreme risk protection order. So we felt there's been a system in place where folks were basically an honor system in some cases where they were told you're subject to this order, you need to surrender your weapons. Well, in many cases, nobody was following through with that system. So our unit formed to really put eyes on folks that are court ordered to surrender, like the extreme risk protection order. And so in 2018 is when we saw the most significant numbers change for implementation. And that's when our unit formed. And our role as a prosecutor in it is to guide law enforcement to appear as a friend of the court, to give information to the court about extreme risk protection order laws, and just to provide general overview of legal guidance on the law itself.
I find that in California and in Washington State, the relationship between law enforcement is critical. And I want to turn to our partners in Florida to hear, certainly, only law enforcement can petition for risk protection orders. So can you talk a little bit about how law enforcement in your county are using these orders really with the sheriff's office as well to help implement and keep communities safe, as we've heard from our friends in California?
Sure. When Florida, the law passed in response to the Parkland shooting, and it uniquely became effect upon signing. So we were all left with trying to implement a law that was already in effect. That caused a manner of urgency. We had great partners with the court and with the clerk's office, but the statute only allowed for a law enforcement officer or a law enforcement agency to bring these petitions. Therefore, as the law enforcement agency in Pinellas County, Sheriff Bob Gualtieri offered to implement these risk protection orders on behalf of all of the police departments as well as the sheriff's office within Pinellas County. That allowed for a unified system to submit with the clerk and for the judges. It just allowed it to go a little easier and faster when you're dealing with one agency submitting these and filing these as opposed to all the different police departments plus the sheriff's office within Pinellas County.
Let me turn now to Sheriff Hopkins. Here in Maryland, we're seeing extreme risk protective orders, and that's a little bit different. Same in terms of ERPO, but in terms of the language, we call it extreme risk protective orders here in Maryland. Can you talk a little bit about the efforts here to train law enforcement officers about the use of these laws and what these new laws are?
Sure. When the bill was signed by Governor Hogan back in April of 2018, the law was going to go into effect on October 1st. And that provided only a few short months for law enforcement statewide to train. You know, there's 17,000 law enforcement officers in the state of Maryland, 160 law enforcement agencies. And that was an incredible endeavor that was going to have to occur because to be ready for such a really change in the way kind of law enforcement does work along with seizing firearms in these mental health type of situations, it did require quite a bit of training. Myself and several other trainers were able to do regional trainings train the trainers for executives. We knew that there would be no way we could get 17,000 in a 4-month period, but we certainly could touch every law enforcement agency through executives and then be able, and through their counsel and through some mental health advocates to be able to then go back and have them train the individuals and their officers. So on October 1 of 2018, when the law went into effect, there were several of them that were issued that first day, and law enforcement was able and ready and were already had the idea and the processes in place to be able to effectively do these.
So 2 follow-up questions for you on that. You said that training, not necessarily every individual in terms of law enforcement, but you were able to train the executive leadership. Did you find that there were challenges or folks not necessarily willing or understanding why this was important? So question one, and then follow-up question two, you said there were a number of petitions that on the day of implementation of this new law that were already filed. Are you seeing an uptick in those numbers that are coming in?
So from the law enforcement training perspective, it was just sheer numbers of trying to actually train 17,000 law enforcement officers in a very short period of time was never going to occur. But as a train the trainer, you could actually then take a class regionally and then have them go back and set up not only how tactically to do these, but the directives and the processes. We provided everything for law enforcement statewide, so the paperwork didn't have to be recreated. So it was already in place. All they had to do was put their own logo on top of it, amend it, or whatever they needed to do to make it work in their own agencies. And because Maryland has a unified court system, it was going to be similar whether you were on the Eastern Shore, Central Maryland, or on the Eastern Shore. So that has all worked. Since in the 8 months, Maryland's seen 568 actual protective orders, extreme risk protective orders been issued. It is averaging about 75 a month. There's been a couple months that are a little higher than others, but on average, we're still seeing about 75 a month. And they are in situations that somebody clearly is in crisis, and clearly it is helping.
Yes, thank you. So Josh, you have a big picture view of these laws and how they're being implemented in different states across the country. What are some of the questions that you are hearing from law enforcement about these extreme risk protective laws?
So I think a number of these are just how do we develop the systems to really make sure that everybody and all our agencies are coordinated? I think that's the biggest thing we hear is how do we make the partnerships? How do we develop the systems? How do we copy some of the things that have been going around the country? Our role is to help identify people who can share that information. There's a lot of other types of issues, though. I mean, I think one of the things we want to make sure is that that service is done properly, right? So that especially for people who may be vulnerable or at risk, how do you do service in a way that gets what you want to do accomplished at the same time doesn't get people hurt? I mean, I think that's one of the things that we hear a lot. What do we do about juveniles, right? How do we get if the juvenile has an order? What do we do with the guns that may be in the home of the family members? So there's a lot of questions like that. Another good example would be, what do we do when it's time to return the firearm? How do we do that? And remember, this is a short-term order. How do we return the firearm in a way that ensures community safety? What if the person has not has been doing well, then the firearm comes back. How do we determine if the person isn't doing well? So those are a lot of the questions that we've been dealing with today. It's exciting to get all the experience here together because someone's got the answer in the room. And so we've been able to share it among the folks here in the panel, but also with some of the jurisdictions who are just learning. So for me, it's been a half day, but we're looking forward to the afternoon because these questions are getting answered, and we're really excited about being able to share them with all the jurisdictions that are starting to do this.
Josh, can you also talk about why it's critically important for agencies who are implementing these to do their best for people who are really in crises?
Well, look, a lot of people, the reason people are getting the orders is because they're in some type of crisis, right? It could be that they're having an issue with substance abuse. It could be, and not always, but it could be there might be some kind of mental health crisis. It may be that someone has just really got so angry that they just aren't seeing things clearly. And so law enforcement needs to be able to identify all of those types of issues. They need to approach these with caution. This is not necessarily a place where, in every case you need to call out the SWAT team and knock down doors. This is a place where you want to treat people who are in crisis with compassion and figure out what's the best approach for them. And sometimes we've seen a really nice examples of it from Seattle and from San Diego and other places and in Maryland about developing the type of resources and responses that help that person. You see situations, we've seen this in Seattle, where a couple comes in hand and say, this is really helping helping somebody in this relationship. It doesn't have to be an adversarial relationship. We're seeing law enforcement work with healthcare providers to make sure that the people who are being subject to this are getting not only the firearms removed, but additional help as well. So law enforcement has to have, this is a tool, but they have lots of other things that they can bring to the situation. And people who are thoughtful about it, and all the people here are incredibly thoughtful, will do this well. And we'll do this in a way that helps those people who are in crisis be safe, and recover, and make sure that they can go about their business. That's the idea of all this. It's not to criminalize people. It's a civil protection order. It's really to help the people who are subject to the orders.
Thank you for that, Josh. So a question for all of you. Josh mentioned this is really thinking about how to work with these individuals in a compassionate way, saving communities, being supportive of communities. So I want to hear from all of you. In what situations are you seeing these laws being used?
So in our first 100 GVROs, about 40% of them were domestic violence related. We had 25% or more that had substance abuse related issues in them. And really, it's not only the individual who's in crisis, but the family is in crisis, which is why I think in our jurisdiction in the city of San Diego, that law enforcement has had a much larger role. And that is because we are here to take on the burden of those family members in order to ensure the safety, to make sure that the firearms are removed immediately, in order to make sure that the family doesn't have to be the bad guy in the situation. And, it's very akin to a domestic violence prosecution model. However, this is the civil, side of it, but it really is involving all of the same components we see in volatile instances.
There's been a lot of positive examples actually where they've come in fully cooperating. They understand they have a problem. They understand that what they're feeling isn't right. We've had situations in San Diego. We're very close proximity to a lot of military bases. We get a lot of PTSD cases, combat veterans who understand that what they're thinking isn't on the normal, yet they don't want to go in and be diagnosed with that stigma of PTSD. So we had a situation where a guy called the police on himself because he knew he was about to do something crazy, and he also had enough cognizance to know that it wasn't right. We suicides where they're just going through a rough patch in life, and they want to end it all with their firearm. The police come out. Those people get counseling. They get help. They get through that rough patch, and they're okay. And then they're responsible gun owners at that point again. Substance abuse, people get treatment. The criminal system, as a prosecutor for many years in California, I can say that the drug criminal system more often does not work than does with the diversion programs, the treatment programs. Statistically, they just don't, we see them over and over again running through. That doesn't really correlate to firearms, though, in a lot of these situations. So we get people where they really want their guns, they really want to make a difference. Instead of just some canned treatment facility, they can actually get some help that's meaningful without being stigmatized with the crime side of it at the same time. So.
Thank you.
In King County or the Seattle area, I would say we see a variety of different cases. In the beginning, in 2018, the vast majority were threats of self-harm or suicidal ideation. And I was in court when some of these individuals, the respondents, are coming into court. And it's pretty remarkable to see some changes in people. And I have to say, they were personally thanking the law enforcement officers that issued the extreme risk protection order against them and saying, you basically gave me some hope that somebody cared enough to step in. And as Josh mentioned, something that's sort of unique in our jurisdiction is we also have an advocate who works closely with me and other prosecutors because maybe family members or they're not comfortable going to law enforcement to petition, or they need to talk to somebody that's not law enforcement. So we do have an advocate that's guided. As Josh said, there was a girlfriend that petitioned against her boyfriend. And as a domestic violence prosecutor, it was a pretty unique experience to see them come into court together holding hands, because unlike any other protective orders in our system, they have restraint provisions. And the extreme risk protection order is only about, in Washington, access to firearms and concealed pistol license. So in many means, it's less restrictive, and it's a good option for families in that means. And I would say also towards the end of 2018, we have seen more increasing cases with threats of harm to others. And we've started to also partner with some of our federal agencies to be able to share information to make sure that we're covering those threats, especially when we're concerned about ideology and some other emerging issues.
In Florida, only the law enforcement can petition for a risk protection order. Therefore, when we implemented our system, we anticipated a very adversarial system and included within it a method of serving these witnesses to appear in court. What was surprising to us is that it was not as adversarial as it first seemed that it would be. Although these people, the witnesses, were compelled to appear in court, a lot of times they agreed with what we were seeking to do, which was simply a timeout from owning or possessing firearms for this period of time. It just wasn't a time in their life that they should have access to firearms. Therefore, we were surprised at, we still subpoena everyone to appear because it's certainly not in every case, but we expected it to be a lot more adversarial than it turned out to be.
Clearly in Maryland, overwhelmingly, it's definitely been a nexus to mental health. People in crisis of some sort, and what the underlying cause is, it's not really for us to get into it, but no question. And so from the perspective of family members, they're either coming in from 911 calls from the family or from another, somehow law enforcement is getting called in. We have been involved in emergency situations or urgency situations forever, but we've never had this clear law in Maryland that allows now for the statutory removal of these firearms. And we know from domestic-related cases, from protective orders, that if in family violence, if you remove the accessibility of the firearms from the equation, then everyone else is going to be safer. And there's due process provisions built into the law, so we're not keeping the firearms forever, but we will return them when someone is actually able to be stable and not a threat to themselves or others. And from the family perspective, it's compassionate. It really is, because family often provides us the consent because, number one, they want their loved one to be able to be here tomorrow or today, and not to mention they want to stay safe as well. So from the perspective, even though the mental health has a large nexus to it, whether it's domestic related or whether somebody's in crisis, it all kind of falls under a realm of someone needing help to get past that moment.
And thank you for that. I want to go back to Shannon. Based on what Sheriff Popkin just noted about families and the compassion of families, given that Florida is a law enforcement petition state only, are there considerations for expanding that to family members?
I believe that that was discussed this year in Tallahassee, but it did not pass. If a family member is concerned, they can call law enforcement, who will then take a report and once law enforcement's involved, they'll do their own assessment. The difference being that the only petitioner can be law enforcement, but anybody can call law enforcement and say that this person is a danger to themselves or others. It just takes that added step of law enforcement actually bringing the petition, as opposed to a mental health provider or a family member to actually bring the petition.
I see. Let me just ask, and I'm going to ask each of you again. What do you think is the most important thing for other states to think about when implementing these ERPO laws, right? And so what would be the one thing that states who are either in the implementation process or developing their own laws, what is the one thing that they should be thinking about and being mindful of?
I'm sure I'm stealing this from everybody else, but how do you create the right partnerships, to create the right ability to work between law enforcement, prosecutors, and the judiciary to bring this all together? That's the biggest piece, is making sure that you coordinate and you have great partners.
In the legislation development side, I would highly, highly recommend and push for a longer period that a court could potentially have the courts, have this order enacted. So, for example, issue it for up to 5 years, and on a yearly basis, the respondent could come in and demonstrate to the court why it needs to be removed, because it is very fast. That 1 year time period is very fast, and there are a number of individuals who have ERPOs against them, and they don't have the manifestations of something that is going to change. If you are an elder with dementia or Alzheimer's, like that is probably not going to get better. And maybe the likelihood of them coming to court, but you really want to be able to have some more flexibility in the law.
I think one of the most important things to consider in the developmental stages is pushing education first and foremost, not to overreach when you file these and abuse the process in any way. Use it only for what it's intended for, and mass educate everybody. And the purpose for that mass education is to keep the politics out of it. Because so many, in this day and age especially, you're either on one side or the other, and guns is a huge issue. And this can so easily be politicized. I've been talked to by people all the time. It's a government gun grab. It's just another way to intrude upon our lives and our homes. But when you actually sit down and talk about the cases that you're filing, you talk about the kinds of people who you are filing on and removing the guns from in a cooling off period type of a situation, they can't argue with that. And once they educate themselves and you help them and they understand what this is really for, that it isn't political, it's about public safety, first and foremost, the safety of people, their families, the safety for law enforcement officers, and it's to cut down on the number of mass shootings that we see in the news that could have been prevented. And when you look at it through that lens, the politics are out, and I think that has to be pushed at the forefront.
I second everything that's been said. I would say from our perspective, it was really critically important to get model policy done. So that's kind of painful legalese, but to have the partners sit down all together and come up with a uniform model policy for extreme risk protection order was what we did in King County. And that was very effective in getting law enforcement and legal advisors to understand all the risks and steps that are needed for implementing the law. So I'd say that's really critical, because then you're going to work off the same roadmap. And I agree with the education piece. That's something we're still struggling with, is how do we reach the public to be able to educate families that this is an option. We're still doing that with law enforcement as well. So I think those are really critically important. But I do think you need to have a framework that everybody agrees on for the very basics. That would be my tip.
In my opinion, it's the law mandates that it be entered into FCIC, NCIC within 24 hours. Once all the work is done to identify the person and to get the order implemented by a judge, if the states and counties can't communicate with each other, which is how they do that through the FCIC database, if it's not mandatory that it is inputted, then it would all be for nothing.
As I mentioned to you earlier, I had the opportunity to actually sit on the legislative work group that put the bill together in Maryland. And without the real leadership of some of the legislators in Annapolis and Maryland's legislative body, it would never have occurred in Maryland. So the really, as it takes a village to do anything in any community, it really has been that way with the implementation of these laws. For states that are just coming on board, that have already passed, there is an abundance of expertise throughout the country and jurisdictions that have already done this. Reach out. You don't have to recreate things, even though your law might be slightly different, slightly a little bit here and there change-wise. But in general, there is someone with an answer that can help you with something. In states that the legislation is potentially going to be introduced in their next legislative session, I think that they really need to look towards the states that have passed. And every year, as the new states have come on with legislation that has been passed on ERPOs, I think the law has gotten a little bit better and a little stronger. And that's because of the involvement of lots of stakeholders that would have a piece in the legislation process as it goes along.
Thank you. I would just turn to you, Josh. I'm going to take some questions from those of you who are online.
Sure.
But Josh, I would ask, as you see this again, big picture,
Yeah.
Is there anything that we're missing or that we should be considering or that you need for all of us to know as we think about ERPO and implementation?
Well, I think implementation is very important, but it's also true that we only have 15 states in the District of Columbia now who are doing this. And while we're learning a lot and we're saving lives, that doesn't mean that our work is done, right? As advocates, we need to make sure that people who live across the United States have access to this. So there's some federal legislation that will potentially improve access to this, but really this is going to be up to the state legislatures. And we think it's incredibly important that if you live in a state that doesn't have ERPO, that you're involved in making sure that we get that process, because we know this thing saves lives. We have great expertise to do it. But if law enforcement and family does not have clear legal authority, then it's all for naught. So we need to make sure that right now that we expand this so people across the country have access to this new and unique tool.
Thank you for that. So here's a question from online. What advice, I think we chatted on that. So how do you apply this law in various cultural settings, given the climate of law enforcement and communities in urban areas versus rural areas? So anyone can take that?
Go ahead. You're the police officer. I'll let you start.
Sheriff Hopkins.
So from the perspective of community and cultural awareness, this goes along with anything else law enforcement is doing these days. You have to be culturally competent no matter what you're serving. And no matter what the objective on these particular cases is to remove the firearm and to make sure to get someone the mental health treatment or serve them the order to make sure that that particular home is safe. And that's the bottom line on this. The compassion and the cultural competencies that come along with it is training that law enforcement has been involved with in a long time. And although there have been incidents throughout the country that has been, somewhat touching on the ability for law enforcement and community to get together, this is an urgent emergency order that if is not acted on immediately, someone could potentially lose their life. So to make sure that someone is willing to reach out and willing to have law enforcement come in, it's all the work we do with communities in advance through education and through community involvement, that then hopefully somebody will be willing to call 911, so that there is never a concern about calling us, to making sure that homes are safe and that somebody who needs help gets that help.
Thank you for that.
And to add to that, what I've seen is the step beyond that. I think that this law actually strengthens the relationship between communities and police. I worked in a station for a few years, and one of the biggest things I would hear from community members complaining is, we called the police and they didn't do anything. And a lot of times they don't have that understanding. That's because the police, their hands are tied legally. They can't do certain things. But the layperson doesn't always understand that, looking at it through their point of view. This law actually allows the police to do something when previously they weren't able to. They can look forward to prevent something instead of always looking back at what had happened and is it enough? So that would be my take on that.
And I would add, there's a strong role for research here. We want to understand who's being affected by these laws. We want to collect the demographic information. We want to make sure that people aren't being disproportionately impacted. And part of the convening here is for us to be able to compare that data, to understand it, and if there are corrections needed, to do that. And so I think that's one of the reasons it's so great to be here at Hopkins, is to be able to have the people who can help us analyze this, look at this carefully, and make sure this is being done effectively and fairly.
Awesome.
I just wanted to add that I think it's really important to also have different access points. As I said before, we have an advocate that's not affiliated with the police department, although is affiliated with the King County Prosecutor's Office. But we've also, on our plan is to also do outreach to clergy and other points of contact. So we've had school resource officers, we've talked with officials at the hospital, Children's Hospital in our area. So I think giving educating other people who may not feel comfortable coming directly to law enforcement, but having somebody else who can help advocate on their behalf and then connect with the appropriate people to still serve that same emergent need of removing the firearms, I think is really important.
Awesome. I want to go back to Sheriff Hopkins. Maryland is unique in that you have, or we have, 24/7 petition access. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Maryland's one of the few states that has access to extreme risk protective orders 24 hours a day. The Maryland legislature added the ability under Maryland's Constitution for the district court commissioner, who is the part of the judicial branch of government, that can issue orders and warrants during non-court hours. So because of their forethinking on this and their ability to really kind of be forward thinking on it, the commissioners have actually issued more than 50% of the orders. And then therefore, there is never a time that someone can't come forward, can't get an order. They're available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I believe the reason Maryland's numbers are such that there's been so many orders is because of the accessibility.
I think that also speaks to the previous question about cultural sensitivity and folks feeling that they have access to and opportunities to do so in a relationship. And I know that many of you, or all of you, have touched on the importance of having partners and relationships with various organizations. And I wonder, Josh, if you can talk a little bit, a little bit about the importance of relationships in all of these various aspects and organizations for these laws to be able to be implemented in a way that's culturally competent, in a way that people feel safe, in a way that communities feel supported, and that the individuals themselves have an opportunity, I think, as Jeff said, a timeout, cooling off period.
Yeah, I think some of the partnerships that are most important here are especially from the advocates within these different offices. So, for instance, and I can let Seattle talk more about this, King County, but that there are people within the systems, within the prosecutor's office, who are used to working with domestic violence survivors and helping them navigate the system so that the system doesn't seem adversarial to them. We think those types of partnerships, so you have to have all the people I just mentioned, the courts, the law enforcement, the prosecutors, but also partnerships with domestic violence advocates and providers, partnerships with people who have ties to the community, whether they're within the system, which is a really fantastic way. And I love it when prosecutors spend their resource to create advocates within the system, or it's community members. But building those, building that type of trust is important. Sheriff Popkin has been great with this. We've been privileged to be able to participate in trainings for domestic violence advocates, building that trust so that they understand what we're doing when a client comes in. It's the same thing with any type of advocate here. And I think you mentioned clergy before, but like making sure that we're reaching out so that within the system we have advocates who care, but also that we're reaching out and doing training so that people in the community understand what's happening. That's a very important partnership. And one of the reasons I think Maryland's been so successful, in addition to the law enforcement trainings, there's been multiple, maybe dozens of community trainings. So people feel like, I get this, I'm comfortable, I understand the system. So when you think about those partnerships, it's across the systems, but it's also across the government systems, but it's also with the community members and bringing them in and making them feel comfortable and not forgetting that they're a really crucial part of this.
Anyone have anything else to add? So I want to go back to Josh, specific to the website that was just launched today. Maybe you can just spend a few moments talking about the specific elements that can be found on the website as well. Yeah. And I know represented by every state that's here.
Yeah, I don't know if folks can see it, but that's sort of that's the homepage of the website. We wanted to do a couple of different things with the website. Number one, we wanted to provide technical information. So if you're in Maryland and you understand what the difference between an emergency order is, or a emergency domestic violence order or a extreme risk protection order, you can find that. If you want to know the difference between an emergency evaluation and extreme risk protection order, you can find that. We have details that compare all the laws that are in existence, what the statute is, what the time frame is, where you go to get it. So we want to give those information to people who we think who are going to use what I call super users, the people here who are implementers, but also the general public who's saying, what is this? How do I understand this? So we want to make I think you'll find this site is probably the most technical detail if you're looking across the web out there. But the other thing is we want to provide access for people. Why is this important? What's the data behind it? What are some of the facts that I need to know if I want to describe this or even advocate for it? So we want to have the technical details. We want to have the comparisons between states, but we also want to give people easy access to some really critical points when people are thinking about, should I make a petition? Should I advocate for this type of law? What are those things? And also something that we hope that some of my panelists will join in soon is a blog for implementers. So we get to really see what's going on behind the scenes. My partner, Shannon here at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, who's my research partner, and I wrote the first blog for this. But, it's not going to be the last, so I invite this panel to think about, writing those things. But we want to give people the information and sort of some of the behind the scenes things that will make people comfortable and understand the process.
So thank you for that. I just checked. We have one question from Maryland. We've seen ERPO being used all across Maryland, whereas in other states, typically 1 or 2 local jurisdictions are taking the lead. Why is the effort in Maryland statewide, in your opinion?
I think it was twofold. I think it was the way Maryland's legislation was put forward. First of all, I think all the stakeholders being involved in the actual passing of the law in Maryland, law enforcement and community training, the educational piece that was put forward so the community could know about it, the unified state court system, so it's the same wherever you are in the state of Maryland. And I think a combination of everything and the continued work that is going on these and the continued training is the reason that it doesn't seem to be slowing down in the same number of orders. I don't think there's any more people in need in Maryland. I just think we're answering the need better.
So in the few minutes remaining, I would ask each of you to respond to this question. What do you think is the most important thing about extreme risk laws that you want our audience to be able to take away from today?
I'll just start that, if your family member is in crisis for whatever reason, if you're worried that they're at an elevated risk of dangerousness, and we know family members just have that sense. You don't have to know all the reasons or even all the causes, but there's a change in status and you're worried. There's a tool here to help. And you can file an order yourself, but really there's law enforcement here to help. And we want you to get that help. We want you to work with all the tools that are there. Law enforcement now has the clear legal authority to safely remove a firearm. And this is how you save lives. Don't sit there. If you're worried that a loved one is at risk because there's a firearm access, let's work together to make sure that we mitigate that risk temporarily to protect your loved one and the community.
In our jurisdiction, I think that it's really important to look on the back end. How many of these orders have become quote, permanent? California will call them permanent orders, but really it's a 1-year order. How many have we followed through with? Are we doing our job in order to make sure that we are maintaining safety and not letting things lapse? If a family member does file an order and doesn't follow through, can we and do we have the resources to maybe look at it and do an independent analysis? Because then maybe the police can conduct their own investigation and file an order. And I think it's the ability to have known quantities of information and be more comprehensive about it moving forward.
Kind of stole my answer, so I will adapt on the fly. I think for anyone watching this who is implementing their own program or in their fledgling stages of implementing a program, the key is you've got to open lines of communication now with the partners that are going to be involved. It's going to be hard, and there's going to be a lot of roadblocks. There's going to be a lot of adversity just in getting the process itself down, both internally and when you're adding these additional entities. So open the lines of communication now with the courts, with the police, with the communities. Get everybody on the same page so that you have a goal. When everybody tries to work on this separately, independently, but with the same overall goal, they end up conflicting with each other and clashing in ways that make it very difficult for a program to succeed, because so many give up and fail after their first few are so difficult, and they think this is impossible, and they stop.
I would say that this is a tool to give people hope, right? We want to be able to say there's this brief window of opportunity where we've seen those warning signs. It gives an opportunity to come in on the civil side to prevent gun violence and to intervene prior to that criminal case coming and sitting on our desk as a prosecutor, right? So I think that is the most significant message, and we've seen people expressing gratitude to the court and to the police for intervening. So I would say that that's my primary takeaway.
My advice would be not to reinvent the wheel. Most of us up here could tell you what works and what's not working, and to start from scratch with trying to blaze this trail on your own. We can at least tell you some of the things that we've done, from how you store all the firearms that are taken, what kind of procedures to release them. There's a lot of operational aspects to this law that aren't being discussed, but that are very real and require resources and thought beforehand.
There's no doubt that these orders are saving lives. And I've received phone calls from actual people that we've served this order on, that if we would not have done something, that they likely would not have been here. So getting a phone call from somebody thanking you for, helping save their life, and it's not just them. Yeah. There's brothers and sisters and moms and dads, and these sort of orders, whether it's extreme risk protective orders or domestic violence orders, really, they're saving lives and they're making our community safer. So for states that are still coming on board, reach out, hear more about what's going on in the other states, because these things are making a difference.
And are states able to contact you directly if they're interested in doing so? I know that we have our website and you can go on and there's a specific email address for folks to share their questions. But if states are looking for specific guidance from any of you, are you open to having them respond or contact you directly?
I'm contacted regularly and more than willing to assist in any way, shape, or form.
Ditto.
Yeah. Awesome. Josh, before I do just a few closing remarks, I wondered if you want to share any specific thoughts about this session, anything about the research findings specifically, just a little bit more about these laws, what we've been able to do here at the School of Public Health through this funding, and then how others can be in contact, and what are some of the things that we should be thinking of as we move on to the next phase of implementation.
Right. So what we've been able to do is start collecting data. That data is really just in its infancy of collection, but we're excited to have that the Bloomberg American Health Initiative has allowed us to start collecting that data, to start thinking about what this looks like, thinking about best practices. And so as we, some of the early findings are that seems to be a very useful tool, especially for people who are at risk of suicide. That's something that we've watched very carefully, and it seems to be something that this was designed in many ways to make sure that people had a different set of tools for people at risk of suicide. The early data coming back seems that this law has been used for that purpose, which is very gratifying, having helped develop the law. Thinking about, you think about starting to see that data come back and thinking about lives that have been saved and looking at, the individual circumstances gives you a great hope that this is just in its infancy. But as far as sort of our research findings, we're going to be publishing them, but we're still in that collection phase and we're analyzing them. But the good news is that so far we've seen some really encouraging trends that show, number one, that the law is being enacted fairly. Number two, that, as I mentioned, that we're starting to see it, we're seeing a really effect on people who are at risk of suicide. And we're starting to collect the anecdotal information about some of the, some school shootings or mass shootings that have been stopped. And we hope to be able to put that together in some format that will show, just how effective this tool is. As far as today goes, and going back to this, I am incredibly grateful for this panel, for the law enforcement who has come here, for the advocates who have been here. We have healthcare providers upstairs working with us today, and for all those people who have come together and shared so freely and are saying here, we'll give you our time. Call us. We want to help. I think one of the things that the Bloomberg American Health Initiative has done is provided a format for us all to be together. And we've been able to bring people from across all corners of the country. And so, to me, one of the most important things about our work that we've been doing here is to bring that group together. Let us learn, but also let them share with each other. So it's been a half day so far. Looking forward to the rest of the day. But I think the results are going to be that we're going to get best practices delivered to the people who need them most.
So thank you, Josh, and thank you, panelists. My final thought is that we've heard from 4 states. We've heard the multidisciplinary relationships that need to exist. We've heard the importance of hearing from education or getting education, having training, the legislative supports that are necessary. We've also heard the challenges. And we also understand that there's a variation in titles. We have gun violence restraining orders. We have extreme risk protective orders. We have extreme risk protection orders. But what we've come away with is that these laws save lives. These are laws and tools for families, for law enforcement, for clinicians, that supports the health and well-being of individuals and communities. So I want everyone to join me in thanking the panel. Thank you for your work. One of the things that I've heard from Kim specifically, these are laws that provide hope. And here at the Bloomberg School of Public Health and with the Bloomberg American Health Initiative, we focus on impact in communities and impact across our country. And so I believe and I'm grateful for the work that each of you are doing as we think about extreme risk protection laws and what we can do to save lives here in our community and across our country. So thank you for joining us, and thank you for the work that you do.